It takes no effort to have the door open and let the light of God into your life. But as soon as you tell yourself the story that the door is open and the light of God is in your life, you place a character, an image of who you are inside your mind. This is hard for some people to follow, but it's the truth of it. And when you place that character in, you close the door. Because humility is the state without the character. Humility is the human organism with the door open, the light hitting it, and it doing the will that the light speaks to it. When you tell yourself the story that you're doing the will, the humility falls. I have a very big weakness as a man, and we can call this a spiritual weakness. I believe this weakness and my journey with it can help people. I believe it can help some of you listening right now, because I believe that many of you are probably tormented by this weakness, how it generates separation from contentment, compassion, love, joy, how it generates separation from the presence of the allness, and how it sneaks in so many formats. It's unbelievable. This weakness is pride. And don't be so proud as to think, oh, I'm not proud, I don't have pride, I don't need to listen to this. Because you probably are. We all are. But it's a deep poison for many of us. And so, to share what I've learned about the arising of ego through pride, the disastrous arising of an ego. Egos are beautiful, they're needed, I have one, you have one. But the ugly side of that manifestation. I'll need to take you just briefly on a personal part of my story. Back to when I first started my walk with God, building something in the world for that love. I was deeply rooted in a state of consciousness whereby I was present in nowness, and I felt this fresh vibrance, vitality and love coming from, through and into me from God. As I walked, I could see in the world that persons were not centered like I was, persons I knew and loved. I could see them in a totally new way. I could see their struggle now. Instead of just seeing the image that I had of them inside me, my senses were alert to see them as they are, not to see them through the filter of an inner person, of an image I have of myself with memories, but for my brain to be free, here and now, to see them with all of its capacity and its intellect. And I could see the struggle even of family that I'd loved all of my life, and now I love them in a new way, because I loved them for who they were, not the image of who I thought they should be. In that state of freedom, I went and following in that state of freedom the signs I received in the nowness, the presence of life, that I interpret to be the voice of God, if I to use language to describe this. Here and now present. These symbols, signs, synchronicities, coincidences came up, and it was a language non-lingual, almost timeless. And I followed that to Africa. When I got there, I was still in this state of freedom, and I felt this intense love for myself, through myself, around myself, from God. I could feel the presence of God. And because I could feel it, I could share it. And staying present, there was no Englishman. There was no John doing that. Staying present in that walk of faith, I was shown to help. I was shown not to help. I was shown persons suffering, and the automatic compulsion from that state of being is to help. Compassion arises through no work of myself. The compassion was a channeled occurrence through the vessel I was, and so I felt a need as the human talking to you, as the human organism talking to you, not as a character inside it. The human organism felt from that presence, from that nowness, that it should do something, and I did. And I was in presence, and it was beautiful, and I was building this family that started from there, family of children, dogs, helping children into school. It was beautiful. But bit by bit, my life became more worldly. You see, when I arrived, I knew that I must stay in that presence, which means I must fast, meditate and pray when I fall away from it, to realign with it. Bit by bit, life became so busy. 10 children, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 150. As life became busy, I began, now I see it as I reconcile my past. I began to formulate inside my mind a story. Instead of moving in presence with a still mind, which is largely how it felt when I arrived, I began to tell myself that I am a person who is in presence and have a still mind. And this is a bad substitute for the reality of presence, because telling yourself that story separates you from it. In time, I made no space for my prayer, meditation and fasting, and before I knew it, I fell into the entanglement of the story, and it was the worst ego I'd ever formed, because this ego had convinced me that I was spiritually awake and present with God, because that was the story I told myself. I don't need to take time to fast, to pray, to meditate. I am spiritually aligned. I am with God. This story was born from a hidden arrogance and pride I was carrying with me when I got there. An awareness that I am in a different space of consciousness. But through no effort of a storyteller. The storyteller had to return back to the silence from which it arose for that presence to be. You see, it takes no effort to have the door open and let the light of God in to your life. But as soon as you tell yourself the story that the door is open and the light of God is in your life, you place a character, an image of who you are inside your mind. This is hard for some people to follow, but it's the truth of it. And when you place that character in, you close the door. Because humility is the state without the character. Humility is the human organism with the door open, the light hitting it, and it doing the will that the light speaks to it. When you tell yourself the story that you're doing the will, the humility falls. When the humility fades, the character arises, the separation begins. And so I became separated from the actual presence, and I swapped the love and presence of God, for all I could have good strong memories of it, for the story of the love and presence of God. And this is what many religious fundamentalists have done in the world, as we see. And so from this emptiness, just as when we were babies, we form a separate character, an image. I formed a separate character, an image from a new emptiness. And so I'm very lucky that I saw that emptiness and then had a false worldly arise within me, because I'm old enough to remember it arising and how it constructed. This led to catastrophic problems for the human organism, because in the presence and the freedom of the presence, the supernatural power of God and the supernatural love of God is the one that the burdens lay upon. It's the one responsible for this supernatural arising of a family. Humans are not meant to have 200 children. We don't have litters for a reason. It's not emotionally sustainable. As I fell into the person, I began to allow the story and the person, there must be a character in the middle of the storytelling, to be responsible for this work. And so I would look out every morning as I wake up and I would see these children, up to 100 in the village, some sick, some very sick, not knowing where the funds would come from to feed them, and they'd all been brought together here by God. But I was telling myself the story that I'd brought them together as this new person, and I was now responsible for their well-being. I didn't know why I went there. I, as a person, which I had created, didn't know why it had gone to Africa. The human organism didn't know why it was going. Spirit knew the journey. Faith was the anchor that placed the human organism inside that journey. Faith and stillness. And the love was the grace felt. And so it was my pride and arrogance that made this new story rise up and separate from presence, and I became sick because the stress was colossal, because I wasn't laying it at the feet of God, because the story had told me I'm in presence, but I was young and immature. I was young and fresh into this walk, and I hadn't even noticed that I was now in the illusion of telling myself the story I'm in presence rather than being in presence, because the memories were so potent and beautiful. It took me some time to acknowledge this doesn't feel right anymore. I'm not in that love and that state, that nowness. God's presence feels absent. And of course it wasn't, it was with me. But the vessel couldn't feel it, because the vessel's channels to connect to it were separated by the ego and its story. And that story creates the pride, the arrogance, because it creates the character separate from God within. This problem remains with me. And it takes new formats, very, very arrogant formats. Sometimes when we have stresses in the charity, sometimes people may betray you, who you thought were going to be solid in this family for God, and they fall from presence, they fall to temptation. And you see those persons telling themselves the story that they're good, that they're with God, but you know they're not anymore. You know they've fallen just as I did. You know they've separated from it and gone into a story that they are it, and formed a religious or a spiritual ego. And with those memories somehow stimulates an arrogance in me. The enemy, the thinking mind, the devil's playground, stimulates an arrogance in me. And that arrogance sometimes will say things like, perhaps I'm the only one present enough to sustain the well-being of this family and children. Without me and my rooting in God's presence, this will not be. With so many people involved, this is a deeply arrogant story to tell yourself. Now you're telling yourself the story that presence, that I know, I have no say in as a story, as a voice, as a character, as an image. Presence and its condition is based upon the door being open, and the door being open is based upon there being no image and character within inside the state of consciousness within inside the human organism. And yet here's a story placing an image of self, taking responsibility for the presence. The sneak of the ego coming in, trying to get some identity. Sometimes I believe it for half an hour, and I feel this pressing anxiety as I look at all these children. And all of a sudden I feel responsible again. Who feels responsible? An image I've created in my mind. And so I put that down because it's pride. It's pride that makes me do that. It's the arrogance and pride of the human vessel and its mind, looking back at the memories of what happened and taking some responsibility for it. Or, in the instance of persons falling and betraying, not forgiving what happened, and therefore carrying with you some small doorway wound for the devil's playground to begin, some small doorway wound for that voice to start. Perhaps I am the only one who will be able to do this. And this works in a funny way as well, because it's true that if we are not in presence and we are wrapped up in the thinking mind, people do suffer because of this. God did not wait like a game for these children that we've liberated from chains and child labour and rape and drug addiction. He did not wait as a game for me to be ready. I was ready, and he couldn't find anyone else ready to do that journey. It wasn't orchestrated that they suffer ready for me to do this journey. The human organism, returned back to presence, will be taken on the journey by the voice of God. Because the human organism free of an image is how the voice of God gets a hold of a tool in this world. The longer we stay caught up in an image of self and thought, the less opportunities and options the voice of God has to propagate the will of unconditioned love in the world. Because as it comes into the vessel may veer off in the wrong direction, because it's relying on a different voice, the voice of the self-conjured image. And so there is a responsibility for us in awakening, for other persons as well. But that responsibility must not become a story that you put on a character. The responsibility becomes one that should trigger your awareness, to be aware that the character has arisen from the mists of the nothingness. Should be aware that if you put thoughts in a tree, it doesn't mean there's a person inside the tree. Should be aware that the human rose from the soils as the tree did. And so just because it has thoughts inside, it doesn't mean there's a person inside it. And it's evident that that's so because your person is not beating your heart and growing your hair. And so when you realign to that space, free of an image and a person, the voice of God can come. The door is open. The light, the love is felt in the human vessel. And you are led to the will of that higher power, that higher love, that compassion. But as you walk that journey, if you tell yourself the story that that's what you're doing, for all there is a story of this human doing that. But it's being done by something beyond thought. And when you make it about thought and mind, you separate from the presence, and the memory of the presence is so potent that you will build the worst ego, prideful separation from God by saying, I am with God. Tell yourself the story that you have God's love. And this is where religion breaks down humanity sometimes. Because we're telling stories to ourselves about who we are, instead of letting God make a masterpiece of our lives with His brushstrokes which come from stillness, come from the emptiness, come from the virginal mind, the mind born again, the body born again. And so more than likely, pride and arrogance is affecting everybody, but some of you listening will need to hear this, I hope, because this is how pride will take hold of your ego and tell you stories, even stories that you are searching to end your ego. You are on the road of awakening, and you close the door to God's light, because the condition of the door being open means no story, no image, no Noah. Just leave the door open. God bless, guys. Be well.
Melissa was born in 2017 with hydrocephalus, which is a condition where an accumulation of fluid occurs within the brain. This excess fluid causes the ventricles to widen, putting pressure on the brain's tissues. Her father left when she was 7 months old, and her mother has been struggling with money and could no longer get her daughter treated and healed. Finances have become so tight they are receiving food and shelter from neighbors. With little to no options available and a sense of desperation, Melissa's mother, Nima, has resorted to prostitution to bring home money. A few years in, she developed fibroids, and her doctor had advised her to stop prostitution or it'll get worse. In the coming days, thanks to our medical fund, Melissa will have access to life-changing and saving surgery. That fund is there to allow us to give immediate help to those children who need it. However, we also have to replenish that fund to ensure we can keep our support available for the next child in need. If you feel like you can help our medical fund in any way, we would love to hear from you. Or you can visit the dedicated medical fund page link in the description of this video. We are excited to bring you updates on their new path in life in the near future. We thank you so much for being a part of our mission to provide resources to children and single mothers who are in need, providing them with sustainable solutions for a better life. Much love, family.